Okay, so dear colleagues, it's my big pleasure to introduce our first panel, which is called Imperial Gaze and Legacies in the Black Sea region. And we are very happy to start with the presentation by Viktoria Serhiienko, who joins us from Kyiv and who represents the Institute of Ukrainian Archeography and Source Studies. And she will be talking about the images of Transcarpathia, Subcarpathia, Zakarpattia in the late Russian Empire. So in a way, it will be a very nice continuation of our yesterday's movie screening where we were talking about the situation in Transcarpathia now, and Viktoria will give us the historical background of also what is happening in this region today. Please, Viktoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much for this nice presentation. And I would like to stress that I'm not in Kyiv now, but in Warsaw. I have little scholarship here. So I will try to show you my screen with my presentation. I don't know how it would be. Yes. Do you see the screen?
Yes, we can see that you started the screen. Yes, we can see your presentation now. Yes.
Great, great. So I will start. My presentation would be about the image of Subcarpathia, Zakarpattia in the late Russian Empire, and it would be about public opinion on Zakarpattia in this time. Yeah. So my first slide, I will show you the region. Yes, you can see this Transcarpathia and this on the western part of Ukraine now we can see, but historically Zakarpattia, it is not only a Ukrainian Zakarpatska Oblast, but also a part of today's eastern Slovakia. So historically, it is larger region that it is now called today Zakarpattia. So in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of 12th century, Subcarpathia and Zakarpattia was the furthest from political storms part of Hungary. The majority of the local Ruthenian Ukrainian population was consisted of peasants living in mountainous areas. The modernization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire has hardly affected the region. The Ruthenians, Ukrainians identified themselves primarily on religious grounds. The so-called Ruthenian faith, Ruska Vira, implied the possibility of being both Greek Catholic and Orthodox. After all, the components of this folk religion were the Byzantine liturgy with certain local modifications, worship in Church Slavonic language with the haphazard inclusion of local words, and sermons in our language. That is in one of the Ruthenian Ukrainian dialects. The relatively small political and economic influence of Zakarpattia was the reason why that until the 1870s, this region was little known in the Russian Empire. While the pan-Slavist ideas and geopolitical ambitions of Russia were directed at Austria and Galicia, the Russian public was almost unaware of the existence of the Orthodox East Slavic population in Subcarpathia. Interestingly, the initiative to open Subcarpathia for Russian public opinion does not belong to Russians, but to Ruthenians themselves. Mainly, I mean the activities of Adolf Dobransky. You can see him on screen. He was a public figure, as essayist, originally from Eastern Slovakia, one of the leaders of the Russophilian movement in Austro-Hungary. In 1875, Dobransky traveled to the Russian Empire, including a tour of both Russian capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as Kyiv. Trying to find support for the Ruthenian revival in its opposition to Hungarian assimilationist tendencies, Dobransky visited almost all or more or less influential publicists, intellectuals, and statesmen of the Russian Empire. I mean, like Ivan Aksakov, Sergei Solovyov, Mikhail Katkov, Konstantin Pobedonosov, First of all, Dobransky communicated with Mikhail Pogodin, whose activity in Galicia led to the emergence of the so-called Pogodin colony. It was an influential Russophilian group in Lviv. However, until the beginning of the 20th century, when the conflicts between the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires intensified and the First World War broke out, the question of Subcarpathia was marginal for Russian public opinion. In general, the concept of Carpathian Rus and Carpato-Russian people, Carpato-Ruski narod, as part of the Russian people, and who must be protected from oppression by the Germans, and especially the Hungarians, developed in the Russian public opinion. As part of such protection, the return of the Greek Catholic population of Subcarpathia to the Russian Orthodox Church was meant. You can see on the screen some publication about Hungarian Rus or Carpathian Rus in late 19th, beginning 20th century. The main characteristic of such publications was that its authors' knowledge of the region, the Carpathians, was purely theoretical. They could never be in a Carpathian region and could write about it. At the same time, a few attempts to get to know Subcarpathia or Zakarpattia face to face, so to say, proved to be more productive. Such initiatives undertook some amateur researchers who did mostly ethnographic studies or ordinary travelers from the high society of the Russian Empire. At the same time, even the most careful testimonies of these eyewitnesses were largely influenced by prior knowledge, by which I mean stereotypes about what the local Ruthenian population should be like. Here are two examples. One is an ethnographic text and the other travel notes of a Russian noblewoman. The first collection of folk songs dedicated exclusively to Zakarpattia belongs to a writer and publicist, Grigory Devolan. You can see him on the screen. Devolan was personally acquainted with Fyodor Dostoevsky and wrote about him some memoirs. The collection Devolan wrote was called Ugro-Russkie folk songs. Representative evidence of real interest, or rather lack of interest, to the topic of Subcarpathia in the Russian Empire is the history of this collection. It was written in 1875. The manuscript was for 3 years in the Slavic Charitable Society, but wasn't printed. Then the collection was transferred to the other Moscow Society of Naturalists, Anthropologists, and Ethnographers. But even there, after a year of waiting, the text wasn't published. Only 10 years after, in 1885, the collection appeared as a separate book. In this book, in the preface, Devolan wrote, in the northeastern part of Ugria, on the southern slopes of the Carpathian Mountains, in the vicinity of Batiev and Uzhhorod, lives a kindred people of Ugra Russia. I don't know these people, I got to know these people not only from books, but personally, when I have visited Ugrian Rus and studied the country called by this name. Ugrian Rus is rarely visited by Russians, tourists, and therefore I consider it as a special happiness for myself to see this country and our Russian tribe living under the Magyar dominance. I would stay here. Because of superficial knowledge of the region, Devolan often makes baseless generalizations. He considers some random things he met in one area as to be typical for the whole region. Here is how, for example, he describes some of the locals. He finds out that the men were of bad physical shape, Lacking strong muscles, they had pale faces, flat feet, and curved legs. Women had chests that looked sunken in and flat breasts. The Volan also sees them as lazy. I would quote, "Only the extreme necessity and danger of starvation could make them work and take their work seriously." End of quotation. He also notes excessive alcohol use. They feel best when they are semi-sober, and therefore they too often consume vodka. At the same time, these characteristics are not an evidence of de Volan's bad attitude toward the people he describes. Such exaggerated, I might say gloomy descriptions are a way of Hungarian oppression mentioned by him before, and the need to liberate these people from the Hungarians. Another book was Travel Impressions, made by Elizaveta de Witte. This book took a wide popularity in the Russian Empire. De Witte, she was a writer and essayist also. She had pro-Orthodox and pro-monarchist views, which left in her imagination no place for the Ukrainian movement. At the beginning of the 20th century, De Witte visited the Slovak and Ruthenian Ukrainian lands of the Hungarian crown. The popularity of her book was explained by the fact that she was an eyewitness, one of the few, and her image of Subcarpathia met the expectations of Russian readers. According to her, the Ruthenians were positive heroes. In her view, they were luckless, endlessly unhappy, and needed to be protected by someone. Their main oppressors, in her view, were the Jewish moneylenders and supported by the Hungarian government. Even a low level of literacy among the Ruthenians of the region, De Witte estimates as a positive phenomenon because of the Hungarian assimilationist policy. In her opinion, the local population escaped from the process of Magyarization, which could be, in the other case, brought by school education. It is worth to mention that the Russian vision of Zakarpattia remained exclusively for, so to say, home usage in the Russian Empire, whereas the Ruthenian Ukrainian intelligentsia was much more influenced by the notion of the region prevalent in Slovak and Czech public opinions. On the eve of the First World War, the discussion about the Ruthenian issue acquired an ambiguous political overtones in the Russian Empire. This region began to be seen as a geopolitical outpost of the Russian Empire in the Danube Basin. The Ministry of War of the Russian Empire has published a large amount of literature on Austro-Hungary. This literature in some way shaped the perception of Russian society and as a part of the society, Russian soldiers, which were to enter the territory of the future enemy. Such publications contained general information about the Austro-Hungarian economy, its political system, and ethnic composition. The group characteristics of Ruthenians on the one hand and Hungarians on the other are noteworthy. If the first ones, Ruthenians, had the epithets like good, honest, beautiful, the latter were lazy. The Hungarians were lazy, which was considered as a consequence of local bad climate. The Ruthenian Ukrainian population was also deliberately described as more pro-Russian than it was in reality. This way of describing them was deliberately written to facilitate a Russian soldiers' relations with the local population. Summing up, I would like to say that, to stress a few points, The first point that Russian opinion began to think of the Subcarpathia and about Carpathian Russian people quite late, in the last quarter of 19th century. The Ruthenians, Ukrainians themselves who moved or visited the Russian Empire played a significant role in the first attempts to popularize Hungarian Ruthenians and their issue in the Russian Empire. The third, the Ruthenians of the region were of interest of Russians only as a part of three young Russian people who had lost their Orthodox roots and they are of Hungarian oppression and need to be somehow protected from this oppression. And the last point, that in the last years before the First World War, World War, as well as during the war, the idea of joining, reuniting, so to say, in the Russian propaganda language, the Carpathian Rus as a part of process, it considered as a part of process of collecting Russian lands. This view on this land prevailed in the public discourse of the Russian Empire. So started as an acquaintance with this region that was almost unknown in the second part of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, this region was considered as a lost part of Russian Empire. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Viktoria. Thank you so much also for being sharp with the time frame. It's very important because all of our panels are scheduled as separate Zoom meetings. So thank you. I think this went quite well. I'm very happy. And I also want to give a warm welcome to all the other people who joined us virtually. Later, we will also show you our audience. So I hope this will be a way to connect. And the next presentation, in a minute, when we settle all the technical issues, I would like to invite Raul Cârstocea from University of Leicester, who will talk about demographic anxieties, imperial imaginaries, and the Jewish question in Romania. I have the scroller or the arrow or the page down.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's also a first for me to present at a hybrid conference, but I'm glad to be here in person. I was for a long time pondering this and eventually decided that I really miss this kind of interaction. And also the topic is very interesting to me. What I'm going to present is a new project, but one that comes out of two long-standing interests of mine. One is the history of anti-Semitism in Romania and Eastern Europe more generally. I wrote my PhD thesis on the anti-Semitism of Romanian toward fascists, and then decided to go back to the 19th century in an attempt to understand why was this so prominent in Romanian politics ever since the establishment of the Romanian modern state. The second long-standing interest is in understanding the area of Eastern Europe as an area and its positionality in the global context. So what I'm trying to do here is combine the two, telling you a story of the Jewish question in late 19th century Romania, in conjunction with the way that Romanian state building and nation building elites position themselves in a European and global context. The premises are, there's this, ever since Michael Rothberg 2009 book on multi-directional memory, the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, there's been a link made between colonialism, what he calls multi-directional racisms in the book, and anti-Semitism, i.e. a reading of Jews in conjunction with colonized peoples and with racism directed against non-European colonized populations. But I find that this bears a too straightforward inclusion of Jews among the category of what Franz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. Instead, I argue that the history of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe tells a more complex story, one where the ambiguous relationship of nation states and empires in Eastern Europe with European colonial project was played out in a similar ambiguity regarding the whiteness of Jewish communities in the region. I'll get back to what I mean by whiteness immediately, which itself was linked to perceptions of both the Jews and their host society's position within the colonial project. It's very important to point this out before I begin. I am concerned here with perceptions of Romanian elites. Not saying these things were real, I'm saying they were perceived, but of course these perceptions had very real consequences later on in the interwar period and later in the Romanian Holocaust. So, what do I mean by whiteness? It's a fairly new concept again, and one that's in fashion in the literature on post-colonialism, decolonization. It basically, in short, it refers to discourses and structures that produce what is known as white privilege. It is primarily racial, but not exclusively so. David Rodinger, someone whose work I've drawn extensively, uses whiteness to discuss concepts of class. And in my presentation, I'll combine both race and class in talking about the Jews. And Steve Garner, who wrote a great introduction to whiteness as a concept, specifies that the meanings attached to race and to whiteness are always time and place specific, and that's something I argue myself that in Eastern Europe these were defined in different ways than they were defined in Western Europe during the same time. As such, I think a short way to put this is that by whiteness I mean the gradient of alterity deployed by East European state-building elites to engage both difference and self-understandings in their positionality in a European or global context. So it's how they refer to populations within their territories, but also how they saw themselves within Europe or the world more generally. And I argue here that the important difference was that their elite's position lacked civilizational certainties and necessarily involved both and above, which was the West that was to be emulated in the 19th century, with many liberal elites trying to transplant, copy Western institutional models and legal forms into Eastern Europe, and the below, subaltern groups within their states, which were meant to be colonized, which were meant to be civilized, which were seen as being inferior to the majority group in the country. These were associated also with temporal coordinates. I don't have time to get into this, but I'll be happy to answer questions about this at the Q&A. Basically, the West was the future, and the subaltern groups symbolized the past, which Eastern Europe was trying to leave behind, its pre-modern condition. Whiteness as class is also important because Western modernity was not just Western-based, it was not just geographical, but it was also class-based bourgeois modernity, which was predicated on disciplinary techniques, on notions of self-mastery, which were productive of both racial and class distinctions, with the two frequently overlapping. In both these terms, in the context of 19th century Romania, these were experienced as what I call constitutive absences, which were visible both in the national and the social questions. On the national level, there was a missing sovereignty. Romania only became independent in 1978. So until then, this stunted sovereignty that Romania enjoyed was seen as a problem by state-building elites. In the social realm, there was a significant debate on the absence of a native middle class, of a native bourgeoisie, which was seen as preventing Romania's progress, preventing its actual belonging to the family of European nations. The Jewish question stood squarely at their intersection, both in the demographic aspect, which was seen as a threat to a national Romania, and in the social aspect. So what I'm trying to argue is that Jews were seen on the one hand as subaltern, i.e. as inferior to Romanians, as more backward, and on the other hand as superior, colonizers even, we will see. And that this reflected Romania's ambiguous position between East and West. It was their way of, it was Romanians' elites' way of negotiating their intermediate position in Europe by displacing it onto the Jews as a other group. So as subaltern, they were compared to colonized groups. They were compared to Arabs and blacks in Africa. They were compared to racialized others, African Americans, Chinese migrants to the United States and Australia were frequently brought up in association with the Jews. And the latter categories were also discussed in anti-Semitic terms. The references there are not to Romania because this was a much more widespread phenomenon. It's not characteristic just of Romania. You find it in 19th century Poland, you find it in 19th century Germany. The two references there are to the German case where, again, these non-European groups were discussed in very similar terms in association with the discussion of Jews in Germany and elsewhere. Along these lines, Romanian elites posited an alleged backwardness of the Jews in Romania, including of the Ashkenazi vis-a-vis the Sephardim community. So the Sephardim community, which was long-standing in Romania, was seen as being much more civilized and much more European than the recent Ashkenazi migrants. And they were argued to be pre-modern. In debates surrounding Jewish emancipation, the granting of citizenship rights to Jews, Romanian elites were keen to point out that they would gladly emancipate the Jews if they were the Jews of France. But these were not the Jews of France. These were the Jews of Romania, who were much more backward than their connationals elsewhere in Western Europe. You've got a quote there around the time of the debates surrounding Jewish emancipation, 1879. A member of parliament who preferred to remain anonymous. He was just a senior or an old deputy. He signed the pamphlet. For anyone who knows the Israeli population in Romania, the image of the Chinese in California seems to have been made on purpose to point out to us the resemblance between these two races, the same aptitudes, the same qualities, the same defects. Thus, the same crises and the same perils manifest themselves at the same time. The same comes back over and over again. The two antipodes of our hemisphere. This coincidence is far from being fortuitous. It proceeds from identical economic causes, that's my underline, which are somehow aggravated for Romania due to the fact that the exiguity of its territory, like that of its population, does not allow it to undergo without danger the intrusion of the Israelite element in the state. Identical economic causes, that's something I underlined because I come back in the conclusions to the fact that I do believe he has a point there. The economic causes, the economic transformations of the 19th century were indeed structuring for discourses of anti-Semitism and race, not just in Romania, but in places as far afield as California or Australia, which was another favorite point of reference. There was Chinese migration to Australia at this time. There were laws in Australia preventing Chinese migration, and Romanian anti-Semites would make reference to them, trying to legitimate similar legislation that would prevent Jewish migration to Romania. But this is only half the story. This familiar story of Jews being seen as subaltern. The other side of the story is Jews being seen as colonizers. They were first seen as agents of colonizers. Obviously, there were long-standing loyalties of Jewish groups in Eastern Europe to imperial crowns. It made sense. The imperial crowns offered the protection that the new nation states could not claim to offer. So, for example, the patriotism of Hungarian Jews in the Hungarian half of the empire after 1867 is well known. They were seen as Magyars of the Jewish faith, and they were contributing to the Magyarization process in the Hungarian part of the dual monarchy. This, of course, came against Romanian plans for annexing Transylvania and uniting with the Romanian brothers across the border in Austria-Hungary. But in these terms, they were also seen as a vanguard of foreign colonization. There was a long-standing anxiety and Teutophobia, as some authors refer to it, in 19th century Romania, a fear of pan-Germanism and a fear of Germany's expansion to the east. And of course, we know that Germany had designs for expansion to the east, so this was not completely off. Romania was not necessarily the point of interest, but Romanian elites wouldn't know that. And because of an underpopulation that was a significant problem in 19th century Romania, there was constant fear of being colonized by a Western power at the time of high imperialism. This is, after all, the time of maximum imperial expansion. So again, it's understandable that there are anxieties about being colonized at this time. In this context, the first way that the Jewish migration to Romania, which was extensive, coming from the Pale of Settlement, was coded was that of an invasion, which is a familiar term if we think of contemporary views of migration among far-right groups. From invasion, this turned to conquest. And there are clear parallels in the language, in the discourse, to the theories of the Great Replacement or Grand Remplacement and white genocide that we encounter today among far-right groups. This colonization was explicitly mentioned by Romanian parliamentarians, by Romanian prominent figures in the Romanian scientific establishment. Vasile Conta was professor of philosophy and one of the prominent 19th century thinkers in Romania, and he claimed that the Jewish Empire, that is Palestine, could well be established in our homeland as well. Alexandru Cuza, professor of political economy at the University of Iași and one of the most prominent anti-Semites, identified the colonization as proceeding first through urban centers and Romanian cities having been transformed already into Jewish colonies. And this had to do, like I said, also with the status of Romania's sovereignty. At the Congress of Berlin, Romania's sovereignty was being decided elsewhere by the great powers. Romania didn't have much of a say in it. Who had a say in it? The Alliance Israélite Universelle. And the fact that a transnational Jewish organization had more influence over the Congress than Romania as an aspiring state did was, of course, viewed with suspicion and resentment by the Romanian state makers. And therefore, this image of the Jew as a transnational force that somehow holds more power than they do in their own country emerges around the debates surrounding Jewish emancipation in 1878. So Jews were both agents of colonizers, other colonizers, but they were also colonizers proper. And you have slippages between the two notions that can easily invert the hierarchy of who is acting as an agent of whom. So it may be at times Jews are acting in the interest of Germany, but at other times Germany has already been Jewified, and it's actually acting in the interest of a global Jewish conspiracy that is trying to take over the world. You can understand why? Because that was my initial question. Why was this so important? It seems that everything is right in Romania except the Jews. And of course, everything was not right in Romania, but everything that was not right in Romania was pinned on the Jews. There was a class dimension to the Jewish question. I mentioned earlier there was an absence of a native middle class. According to Romanian anti-Semites, this absence was due to Jewish competition and was prevented by Jewish competition. Because the Jews were there first, we couldn't develop our own middle class. So you have a Romanian member of parliament responding to this Jewish petitions to European governments in 1878 saying, if you realize that our struggle is not against your religion, but against your desire to monopolize the middle class of our society, tell that to the European governments to which you're sending your complaints. Jews were also seen as a proletariat, though. And here, there was also a discourse of the absence. Romania didn't have a proletariat, and that was good. Unlike the lack of a bourgeoisie, the lack of a proletariat was a good thing because the proletariat at this time was a bad thing everywhere in Europe. So the proletariat was emerging as a problem. And the fact we didn't have one was great. But if you had the Jews come to Romania, then you would have a surrogate, landless, footloose, and potentially dangerous proletariat that we've managed to keep at bay until now. But we can't keep at bay if the Jews come, and because this would eventually open up Romania to all proletarians, Jewish or not, a colony for the lazy, the convicts, and the proletarians of Europe. It's the way that Bratianu, one of the, perhaps the most important state maker in 19th century Romania, put it. Finally, you had Jews as the land-owning aristocracy. The land-owning aristocracy preferred to live in Vienna and Paris and Berlin at this time. So their lands were managed by leaseholders. Some of them were Jewish, not the majority of them, not most of them, but most of them were perceived to be Jewish. And therefore, the rage of the peasants for the dismal conditions was often directed against them rather than the absentee landlords. In response, they were portrayed by the elites as the actual landowning exploiters of the Romanian peasantry. Therefore, you can see that the Jewish question lies at the intersection of the social and national questions, the two most important questions in 19th century Romania. They displaced anxieties regarding both the secondary international status of Romania and its incomplete capitalist modernization. And this is a time of capitalism spreading over Eastern Europe. This ambiguity of the Jew as once the more European locus of desire and the more backward pre-modern source of anxiety corresponds to a similar ambiguity related to Romania's and Eastern Europe's position vis-a-vis the Western European core. I'm going to skip this and go to the conclusions. This is, by the way, the logo of the Alliance Anti-Israélite Universelle, the first international anti-Semitic alliance, which was established at the Bucharest Congress of 1886, the second anti-Semitic international congress after the Dresden one of 1882. And this was their defining image, sort of a logo of this Alliance Anti-Israélite Universelle. Conclusions. I'll finish in 1 minute, I promise. Whiteness and race is articulated differently in the periphery. There's a more complicated pattern of dealing with alterity in the absence of civilizational certainties. If you don't feel like you're at the top of the food chain in the colonial order, you're going to experience colonialism differently, and you're going to be more ambiguous about your own position within that colonial system. Therefore, the subaltern status can shift between self and other. It can be also self-ascribed. Second, seeing Jews defined both nationally, racially, and in terms of class, instead of seeking to account for whiteness in terms of race or class, we should try to focus squarely on their complex imbrication, not to draw precise lines separating race and class, but to draw lines connecting race and class. And finally, Jews during the long 19th century and during the interwar period appear as the privileged figures of authority in Eastern Europe. By privileged, I don't mean they were privileged in any way, but that they were the most important figure of authority. They were the other that's most significant to the construction of a national narrative in Eastern Europe in most places, I would argue. The representation of Jews both reflecting and inflecting the hopes of and anxieties of state builders. Thank you. And sorry, I've gone 3 minutes over time.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think your presentation was packed with lots of very interesting questions and theories, so it will be definitely very interesting to discuss. And now we are going back to our Zoom group regime, and I would like to invite Professor Liebich to give his comments on both papers. Afterwards, both Viktoria and Raul will have time to respond, and then we will have our Q&A session. Professor Liebich, the floor is yours. Please sit in front of this computer so that everybody can hear and see.
Yes, shall I go on? Hello. Thank you for these both these papers. I'll spend less time on Viktoria's than on Raul's because I received Viktoria's paper very recently, so I didn't have time really to reflect on it. She brought back the memory of our very successful and pleasant conference in Uzhgorod a few years ago, where we found Ruthenians. I note that Viktoria has used Ruthenians/Ukrainians in order not to enter the debate about whether Ruthenians are Ukrainians or not. But this seems to me to be a very important issue, which I'll return to in a minute. I'm reminded of a conversation between my thesis advisor and a Soviet specialist who was arguing that Russia had only taken back, the Soviet Union had only taken back what lands it had previously enjoyed. And my thesis advisor said, what about Subcarpathia and Ruthenia, which was never Russian? And the Soviet specialist said, such a little country. Yes, well, it is a little country, but a very, very important country. Not quite in the Black Sea region, so that's the paper of Viktoria should have been in Uzhgorod rather than here in the Black Sea conference. What comes out of the paper is the late interest of Russia in the area. And this is an interest which was under wraps for a long time and only came to the fore in the early 20th century as relations between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire became fraught. The Russians and the Austro-Hungarians did try to come to an agreement about the Balkans. The Russians didn't contest the Hungarian nature of Subcarpathia and Ruthenia, at least politically, for a long time, until the First World War, when the idea of annexing Subcarpathia and Ruthenia came to the fore, as Viktoria has pointed out. Let me turn now to Raul's paper. First, the question of whiteness. I think he's quite right to say that whiteness is connected to class. And we've seen that not only in the East European context, but in the American context. There's a number of books about how the Irish became white and how I suppose how the Italians became white and so on, meaning that they received entry into this, to the privileged strata of American life. Most of Raul's paper deals, however, with colonialism and with the Jewish question. And the Jews were used by the colonizers, sometimes willingly, usually unwillingly, as their fer de lance in the project of colonization. The Jews in Austria-Hungary, as Raul pointed out, were fervent Magyarists. In the Russian Empire, the Jews were subordinated and kept under wraps. They were treated badly. And after 1917, the situations reversed. Austria and Hungary became foyers of anti-Semitism, whereas the Soviet Union, at least in its early days, was a Semistophilic organization. Sletskin has written about this in the Jewish Century, and this was the origin also of Judeo-Bolshevism. One understands that a great many Russian revolutionaries were Jews before the First World War because of their underprivileged status in the Russian Empire. And this was carried over into the fear of Jews in the interwar period. The role of Jews in colonizing Eastern Europe and beyond is a very important one. I think Raul is quite right to highlight this. I don't know much about Romania, but I take it that his examples from Romania are well chosen. It seems to me that today, when there are no Jewish communities, or very few Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, the nature of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has come to the fore as anti-Westernism. What the Jews were approached for was being pro-Western. This was the case in the Ottoman Empire. We have the examples of Solal and Belle de Seigneur and his Western amities. We have the examples of Jews as Westerners, Westernizers in Eastern Europe. And now that there are no more Jews, the anti-Western thrust of anti-Semitism has been directed squarely at Western interests and Western countries. And this, I think, is very, very important. Just as to return to Viktoria's paper, it's very important to note the hostility between Ruthenians and Ukrainians, Ruthenians who look to Moscow rather than to Kiev as their protector, if you will, even though, as Viktoria has pointed out, this protector was absent for a very long time. Thank you.
I think we will start with Raul, and then we will ask Viktoria to respond to the questions.
Should I move there?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that
I didn't check before my presentation. I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me online? Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you very much, Professor Liebich, for the commentary. The point you make about anti-Semitism as anti-Westernism is a great one, and one that I really should consider, because it's not something I thought about, but it's indeed something that's very prominent in Eastern Europe right now, and it's definitely part of what I am looking at. They would express it. I'm trying to use the language of the actors in question as much as possible, and they would refer to this as colonialism, because there's an ambiguity there. These elites are also pro-Western. They are Westernizers. They think France is the model. They first think France is the model, then Germany is the model. But generally, the model is always West. The big enemy is Russia. It's to the East. The East is bad. The West is good for Romanian state-building elites in the 19th century. The West would become most definitely just bad in the interwar period, but it's not the case before World War I. Before World War I, it's certainly a model that they try to emulate. But, as you well pointed out, there are also issues with Westernism. And then it makes even more sense in this ambiguity of them having some issues with being involved in the Western imperial project, but not being beneficiaries of it necessarily. Romania's role in the capitalist economy that reaches Romania in the 19th century is a subordinate one. It makes even more sense in this ambiguity of being pro-Western, but resenting some of the West's encroachment in Eastern Europe, to displace it on the Jews. It's a convenient locus of displacing such relationships of both anxiety and desire for the West. Your point about after 1917 and Jews in the Soviet Union, yes, initially this paper was meant to have two parts, one before 1918 and one after 1918. I realized this is not manageable in 15 minutes, no way. So it ended up excluding the interwar part. The project does cover the interwar part. And the Judeo-Bolshevism as an idea is, I argue, and I'm not the only one, there are many people who argue the same about the Nazis, pivotal in the radicalization of anti-Semitism towards genocide. It's with Judeo-Bolshevism that the Jews are no longer just dangerous, but life-threatening. They become an existential threat to mankind. Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most notorious anti-Semitic text, exists since 1902, and it's produced in Bessarabia by Pavel Kruschevan, a peripheral anti-Semite, writing, as one author put it, in agricultural depot at the edge of empire. That's how Chisinau is seen by by an author dealing with the protocols in a book in 2019. So from this agricultural depot on the edge of empire, the protocols go global. They become this global anti-Semitic text that's translated in a number of languages by 1920s, known everywhere. But it really explodes in terms of popularity then, after the Russian Revolution, not before. And it's in association with the Judeo-Bolshevism that the protocols really become this kind of global bestseller as an interwar book. And Judeo-Bolshevism also had the advantage, I argue in another publication, which I cite in the paper, of displacing class-related demands from the population with the expansion of the vote. There is a rise in left-wing activity throughout Eastern Europe. This left-wing activity is delegitimized by its association with the Jews. So basically, if you're socialist, then you must be in the service of Jews. And in the context of the triumphalist nationalism after 1918 in the region, it's easy to delegitimate left-wing activity as being associated with the Jews. Same thing is happening today. Some right-wing governments in Eastern Europe are portraying left-wing groups as being in the service of today's Soros. It's no longer a Bolshevik Jewishness, but it's very much this anti-West. So the two are actually connected if you think about it. And this brings me to class, and yes, that's definitely what you pointed out about the US. That's also very much a case of simply put, whiteness as skin color is impossible to determine, right? I mean, there was this famous case of the Boston Marathon bombers who would be black in Russia, but Caucasian in America, and Caucasian, it doesn't get whiter than Caucasian in the United States. But in Russia, as people from the Caucasus, they would be considered black, or certainly non-Russian white. So there was a question, which was a life and death question, because they were determining whether the surviving Boston bomber was going to get a life sentence, or if he's going to get the capital punishment. So it was a life and death question whether he's white and black, and we're trying to determine how the jury composition should be, if it should be predominantly white or predominantly black. And they debated this for ages because they couldn't determine if this person, who to an American looks white, but to a Russian does not, is black or white. So you can't determine race via skin color. Race is very much a cultural construct, and one in which class feeds in very well. Someone from an area that's not considered white but who will be upper class has much more chances of being accepted into a white circle than someone of lower class from an area closer, let's say, to the European racial type. So race and class are certainly combined in producing what is, I think, a cultural way of perceiving authority that leads to white privilege. Not necessarily one that's grounded, certainly not one that's grounded in any kind of biological traits, but one that's it's constructed in a very complex manner, combining cultural, national, and class elements.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Sorry.
No worries.
And now we will give Viktoria the chance to respond to the discussant's comments. I know that in the middle of this comment we had a technical issue, so I will ask you, Viktoria, to answer the comments that you've heard, and if there is anything else, any other questions that Professor Liebich asked but you didn't answer, we will ask him to ask this again. Sorry for the technical problems.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your patience when I was presenting my paper. And well, I'm not sure if I hear the whole comment because yes, but maybe I would just say a few words about this topic. Yeah. Well, this region is really quite important strategically. It was for Russian, for Austrian Empire. So it maybe was not very important economically, or in some it was very poor mountainous region, but it was kind of bone of contest for this big imperial forces at that time, between Austro-Hungarian Empire, between Russian Empire. So but this region was not very well known. It was also kind of mystery also for Russians, for some Czechs that opened this region already in the interwar period when it was a part of Czechoslovakia, the first Czechoslovakia. It was always for everyone who entered this region, it was kind of mystery, and it was reopened a few times. So the locals estimated, also was estimated in the interwar period as kind of children's, you know, all these Orientalistic visions were there. So it is very interesting, very interesting case to from the point of view of our, not our, but this imperial stereotypes, some kind of toposes that are continuing in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So I guess, well, that was my comment. If you have some more concrete questions, I'm ready to answer.
Is there anything else that Viktoria missed from your comment, Professor Liebich? No? Okay, in that case, thank you very much to both discussants and our wonderful panelists. And now there is time for Q&A. So I will turn the camera and the microphone to our audience. And in the meantime, I would like also to invite our Zoom participants to ask your questions. You can do this either in the chat section, or you can, if you want to talk, you can signalize, and then we will give you the microphone after the first round of questions. So please, those of you who want to ask your questions, come to the microphone. Okay, Martin and Sandra then, okay?
Okay, please tell me if I stand correctly. I'm the first one to open the floor for...
I think it's okay, it's okay, yes.
Okay, cool. So first things first, the most important things first, Viktoria Chöte.
Can everybody hear?
Well, the questions will now be for Viktoria, so it's, I'm especially asking if your sound is okay right now.
Yes, I hear you.
Is somebody sitting? No? I will just bring my own chair. It's okay. It makes sense because it's a bit longer, so it's like an interrogation.
Do I look like an interrogator?
Okay, I'm here to testify. So yes, I've got a few questions for Viktoria's paper, and the first two ones are more or less methodological, and the last one is a bit more content related. First of all, when you have in your, should I look there? Where's the camera? Okay. Hi. Okay. First of all, when you say in the title of your paper, in the Russian Empire, what do you mean by that? Because the Russian Empire is rather problematic because it's so multilingual still in the period, even due to the Russification of the cultural and the scholarly sectors. There are still, for example, multilingual volumes, collective volumes, which have like at least papers in 5 languages. What do you do with that? And also it might make sense to think about institutions, not even regions. Just think of Kiev. Persons publishing in Kievskaya Starina could be sitting or living next door to, I don't remember how that one little Russian regionalist is called, who published about the region, who was from Kiev. I don't know, there are several brochures from him. How do you conceptualize this problem? And closely related to that, what do you do with the fact that those subalterns, let's put it like that, in Zakarpattia at some point started talking? At least I know from the 1890s, there are locals, like local popes, who started to publish, especially in Ukrainian or some Yazidchia languages, and those things also were circulated to the Russian Empire. What can we do with that? And the third, smaller things, how do you think Jakub Holowatsky and his Piesny as Halecko i Ohorsko Rusi fit in the picture you drew? And also in the Statipo Slovana Vedenia, Ukrainians started publishing also about the region. I mean, Ukrainian nationalists, and in 1908, 5, 10, something like that, even Stepan Tomaszewski, who really was a Western Ukrainian nationalist. But he published a paper in about 100 pages and an ethnographic map on the region in a Moscow journal. So does it in any way fit in your picture, or doesn't it make sense for you at all? So thank you.
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Let's collect one or two more questions, and then we will give. Please, Sandra, I will bring it there for you one.
Or maybe I can see you from back here, right?
I'm not sure if people can hear you from that part, so sorry for this, but you know, we need to adjust to these technical issues.
Well, I kind of want to go back to André's question to how certain people became different people. So this question, of course, is to you, Raul. And I'm here thinking specifically of the book, How Jews Became White Folk in the American Context. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the actual theory, how you connect class to race, and how that fluidity actually plays out.
Thank you. That's I think, an excellent question to both of presenters. Do we have more questions from the audience? Yes, after that we will give the chance to answer.
Before I ask my question to Viktoria, I would like to add something to André's short remark about Transcarpathian Ukraine as such a little country from a Soviet perspective. Maybe you noticed President Putin's historical article in June where he scolded Nazi Germany and Poland for tearing apart Czechoslovakia. And he also duly forgot to mention that 7 years later, in 1945, of course, the Soviet Union annexed Transculturality at the time. So my question to Viktoria is, I somehow missed the notion of irredentism in your talk, because in a way, it seems that from a Russian imperial perspective, of course, the Hungarian Rus, as they called it, was a territory that, well, was basically in a state of irredentism. And how does this relate to the Ukrainian self-understanding of Ukraina irredenta by Julian Baczynski in 1895? Because it seems obvious that, well, the Hungarian Rus becomes the object of some kind of a projection. These are people that belong to either Ukraine or to Imperial Russia. And here, of course, also André's question about, well, who were they, Ukrainians or Ruthenians, again, plays an important role.
Thank you very much. Let's give Viktoria a chance to respond, and then I will turn camera to Raul. This way we will have the continuation.
Well, I see that everyone of you noticed that I'm not presenting here Ukrainian perspective on Zakarpattia. I only choose Russian Imperial or Russian perspective. So I'm not, I was not, because it would be too much and too lengthy. I'm not interested in Lovatsky, Tomaszewski, or other Ukrainians, well, works on Zakarpattia. So, but of course, this region was also interested for Ukrainians as from Austrian part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, for Ukrainians from Galicia, and also from Ukrainians from Russian Empire. So I only choose this Russian language texts that circulated. Of course, there are also Russian language texts written by Ukrainians, yes, but they are presented the other perspective. So I didn't choose them for this presentation because I was interested in this perspective of well, actually just Russian perspective. If we are talking about Ukrainian perspective, I would also like to ask the first commenter what he means when he asks, when he name, for example, Yakov Holovatsky or Stepan Tomashevsky, Ukrainian name, they are Ukrainian nationalists. I don't know how it, if we could name the Ukrainian nationalists. They were Ukrainian activists, okay, but what does it mean, Ukrainian nationalists? You might please explain me this term. So if we talk about talking about Ukrainian perspective, it is quite large topic. From Ukrainian perspective, it looks more or less like this. Drahomanov, he was one of the Ukrainian thinkers that paid a lot of big attention to Zakarpattia. He named Zakarpattia the lost brother, and tried to write some articles on Zakarpattia, asking for some younger Ukrainian activists to visit Zakarpattia. But you know, Ukrainian activists in Galicia has no so much people, has no so much resources, financial or people resources to influence very importantly on Zakarpattia region. The same situation was with Ukrainian movement in Russian Empire. It was just that some magazines or some information did not reach from Ukrainian part of Russian Empire, mostly did not reach to Zakarpattia region. So when, for example, some people from Zakarpattia moved to Russian Empire for some reasons, they're saying that they're moving to Rusko. They didn't divide some Ukrainian lands from the rest of the empire. So for them, this territory was a kind of how to say that it was taken them some kind mythically, yes, because they are asking for some help against to Hungarians and some Hungarian assimilationist politics. They didn't, these local people from Zakarpattia did not go into the details. There was talking about Russian Empire. That didn't catch this, didn't feel this difference between the Ukrainian activists from Ukrainian movements or from this Russian monarchists or Russian liberals or Russian social democrats. They don't very much go into these details. So about
please wrap up.
Sorry?
Please try to wrap up because we have limited time for Q&A.
Okay, maybe I lost something. Could you please remind me, because I thought that I answered all the questions.
Great.
In one answer.
Yes,
but
great.
I lost something.
I think that you did a great job with answering all these complex questions, and we are happy to pass the floor to Raul. And we really hope that we will have some 10 minutes for Q&A from our Zoom participants.
Okay.
You can come a bit closer here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see Sandra from there, so can I stay here?
Can you hear Raul?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. To our Zoom participants, can you hear Raul? Okay, let's continue.
So that's a great question. Thank you very much. The first thing I would say about it is this Ashkenazi-Sephardim distinction that I mentioned earlier. The Sephardim community was dating in Romania from the time of the Spanish expulsion, so 15th century, They were long-standing in Bucharest. They were middle class. They were elite, not just middle class. And the sharp distinction made between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim also shows this combination of race and class. The Sephardim were not the Jews; they were meaning. When they meant Jews, they meant the new Ashkenazi migrants who were poor. So you have these waves coming from of migrants coming from the Pale settlement, who are by no means middle class yet. And this is where it connects with the book you mentioned, with how Jews became white folk. They become white by becoming middle class, in simply put. And the Sephardim were already there, so and they were mostly concentrated in Bucharest. There's also a huge discrepancy in terms of numbers. If you talk about the United Romanian Principalities, or Romania, you have 4.5% Jews, between 3.5 and 4.5% in the period before World War I, because there's a lot of, it varies because there's a lot of migration in and migration out to the United States and to Western Europe. But it's between 3.5 and 4.5. However, that number is misleading because that comprises 10% in Moldova and 0.6% in Wallachia in the south. The community in the south, in Wallachia, is Sephardim. It's tiny, but it's highly influential. In the interwar period, when the Jews start developing their political organizations and start having a voice in Romanian politics, all those organizations are led from Bucharest by the Bucharest Sephardim, not by the Ashkenazi, despite the overwhelming numbers of Ashkenazi Jews in Romania. And this clearly points to this class dimension. It's not so much culture in this case, but it's the fact that those were established business elites that were pretty much associated with the Romanians. There is, however, a very important difference. And the difference is, what I was trying to say is that Jews are white. In many cases, they're whiter than Romanians, and that is the problem. And this is where it's different from the situation in the US, because Romania lacks those civilizational certainties in the United States. And I argue that perhaps the fact that the Jews were perceived as being whiter and more Western than Romanians themselves is more of a problem in the Romanian context. It certainly becomes more of a problem in the interwar period. One part of my paper talks about this. When the fascist deputy makes his first speech in parliament, he says, if the Jewish conquest will be successful, Romanians will be exterminated. What will happen to us is what happened to the Redskins in America. That's the comparison he uses. So here you have settler colonialism displaced onto the Jews, who will take over, will destroy the Romanian native population. And this is only a white group that can do this. It's not a subaltern group. So this is where I think the situation is different from the United States in terms of how whiteness operates.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Do we have the questions from our Zoom audience? Okay, do you want to ask it in the chat, or maybe someone wants to talk? Raise your hand. Okay, do I understand correctly that we don't have any more questions? And maybe, okay, there is one question from our discussant. Please, André.
Thank you. Perhaps to begin with Raul's questioning of the Boston bomber. I remember a Russian colleague who was reading an American paper which said that Caucasians are responsible for this or that. And he said, you see, in America, they have problems with Caucasians too. Well, of course, he meant something quite different. And to return to Uli's remarks about Ruthenia, I remember reading Benish's memoirs of his meeting in Moscow with Stalin in 1943, where in fact he offered Ruthenia to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was reluctant, but of course it gladly accepted in the end. In fact, there was a movement in Slovakia too for joining the Soviet Union in the immediate after-war period. So there was this sentiment of Slavic solidarity, which was very strong in the immediate post-war period. One of the lessons that I drew from our Uzhhorod conference was that Czechoslovakia had not neglected Ruthenia, as the history books tell us. That in fact it invested a lot in Uzhhorod, and it created buildings and brought civil servants and so on. So in fact, the Czechoslovak period in Ruthenia was a happy period for Ruthenia. It didn't remove the Russophile element, which was very strong and which has remained strong, and which is now directed against Ukraine, against Kiev, more than against Moscow.
Okay, thank you. Viktoria, do you want to respond something or?
Well, I agree that Czechoslovakia, yes, I agree with this comment that in part that Czechoslovakia did a lot for this region, for Zakarpattia region, economically, roads, some infrastructure and everything. Yes, but yes, that's true. But still, this Zakarpattia region was quite. In economic, in a modern sense, in sense of factories and so on, it was quite backward in comparison with even Central Slovakia or Western Slovakia. So this division on the very modern West and backward East was in interwar period and still is. If we're talking about today, this Eastern Slovakia, for example, because Ukraine is, it's the other question. If we're talking about this historical Zakarpattia and western part of historical Zakarpattia, I mean Eastern Slovakia, then now Eastern Slovakia is much more undeveloped than Western Slovakia. So a lot of people are going from east to west still, and this region are lacking of jobs, yes, for places to work. It's still, if, for example, some Western investors want to invest for some car industry, yes, car building industry or something, they invest in mostly in Western Slovakia or Central Slovakia. But East is still kind of little worse in this economic situation still.